You know, at the very beginning of the Chavismo movement, there was a convergence of both groups from the left and the right that you needed to revive Venezuela's democratic institutions, reform some of them, get rid of some of them, start new ones. And this produced a convergence on both the left and the right. But what has happened is, as the government abandoned liberal democratic institutions and moved in the direction of a model that was based on concentrating power, what happened is that the biggest divide in Venezuela became not so much between the left and the right, but between those who were interested in preserving liberal institutions understood as checks on the power of the executive branch versus those who wanted the executive branch to have maximum power. So the left-right divide stopped making sense, even though the government continued to use that spectrum to discuss its position vis-a-vis the rest of society. The cleavage was mostly between those who were interested in preserving liberal democratic institutions versus those who were interested in empowering the president without limits. There are several things a government could adopt from the Cuban model. And let me classify them into what would have been great and what would have been bad. What would have been great is to try to incorporate some of Cuba's ideas of making sure that there is a large welfare state that is fully funded and tries to provide for as many folks based on need. That is something that the Cuban model offers important lessons for others. Also trying to emphasize rigorous education. But one could instead borrow the anti-pluralism of the Cuban model, the extent to which the Cuban model has no regard and, of course, no space for anybody who is not ideologically aligned. And in the very beginning, it seemed that Chavez was mostly inspired by the first aspects of the Cuban model, but soon essentially mostly adopted the anti-pluralist aspect of the Cuban model. It's not clear exactly when that preference happened in the Chavez years. Some people say early on and he just disguised it. Others saying later on as he became more powerful. But to me, that's where most of the borrowing has occurred. Borrowing the extent to which the model is sectarian in the worst sense. We only govern on behalf of those who are with us, and for the rest, we have nothing but exclusion and a hate speech to offer. Well, one has to find a way to think of a post-Chavista model in which Chavistas are included. The question is, what do you do with the people who made the worst mistakes? And let me just be clear about the issue. There are many Chavistas who have operated on the illegal side of things and are so invested in all the wrong things that have been done outside of the law and even with protection of the law that they have a major fear of returning to a system based on the rule of law because they know that they're going to be the biggest losers. So an important, difficult challenge, it's a political as well as moral challenge in Venezuela, is what do you do with those forces? Logic dictates that you have to somehow offer some degree of transitional justice and amnesty. At the same time, you want to make sure that you do not erode the importance of the rule of law because that has to be the foundation of a new Venezuela. It's an incredibly difficult challenge, but it means that it is very important for the opposition to think about ways of talking to the side of Chavistas who are eager to try something different, but we have to make them feel confident enough that experimentation on their side will not mean their complete political destruction. Very hard challenge.
How do you see that happening?
Well, I think Venezuela has a good history of making this happen, and that is unfortunate, difficult for Venezuelans to understand because for the past 20 years, a lot of the political discourse has been directed at trashing the best experience that Venezuela has with this. When Venezuela undertook its transition to democracy after 1958, a series of pacts were discussed, not just among the political parties, but also between the new parties and the old regime. And this is what made the transition to democracy so important in Venezuela in 1958, 1959, 60, 61. The problem is that for the past 20 years, and we can blame Chavismo for this, there has been this discourse of hating this notion of a pacted democracy. I'm not saying that it was a perfect model, but I do say that the principle is worth reviving, that Venezuela needs to be able to have a pact, and this pact has to mean that if you're willing to recognize previous mistakes and if you're willing to build a new strategy, there's going to be the possibility of some form of security protection for you. And that is the difficult challenge. But Venezuela can look at its own past for lessons about this. Most people in Venezuela at the moment want a big change to happen right away. So this would tell you it should be easy to have a coalition on behalf of a big change. The problem is that these big changes are not happening, and as a result, when these fast deliverables are not materializing, you get a lot of recrimination, you get a lot of disappointment, you get a lot of frustration. And this is the dilemma that Venezuela has. I think at the moment, the issue is not whether you can create a unifying goal that is very good and easy to produce for anybody, but when this goal doesn't happen right away, how do you keep people who feel that we should have tried this, we should have done this instead, you should have listened to me? That's where the issue is, the possibility of frustration with slow change. That's where you see the real problems. Having said that, let me be very emphatic. The goal of the MUD was to maintain a unified front for elections in Venezuela, starting in the late 1990s. It is a very difficult thing to do. In Latin America, there are very few countries still where the opposition is united. Venezuela achieved it. In terms of preserving a unified electoral coalition, hands down, the Venezuelan MUD is a Latin American success story. The problem is that to fight Chavismo, you cannot simply rely on electoral politics, because Chavismo has discovered, and especially under Maduro, that it's not going to play that game anymore. So the game that the MUD was able to play very successfully is gradually disappearing from the Venezuelan panorama. And this is the big challenge for the MUD. It's remarkable because in many ways, the government is conceding defeat. The extent to which elections are disappearing or are becoming a sham in Venezuela is a testament to the triumph of the opposition in making sure that, at least on the electoral front, the government doesn't score victories. But it also means that the opposition now has to figure out a different strategy, because it's no longer, the key challenge in Venezuela is no longer maintaining unity during electoral contests. Many governments in Latin America have recognized that pure neoliberalism was not appropriate, just as most governments in Latin America recognize that pure Castro Chavismo is not appropriate. So it seems that those models are a little bit out of date. I think a modern left today is a left that first and foremost recognizes the importance of checks and balances on the executive branch, recognizes the importance of market forces, that the idea is to get the state to tax and regulate the Marxists, not to repress the market. And an important element of the left, which distinguishes it today from the old left and contemporary right-wing movements, is its celebration of diversity. This applies to a number of issues, but the left today is at the forefront of ideas that being more inclusive of people who are different enhances deliberation, enhances inclusion. This is really what a new left should look like. It was remarkable in the case of Venezuela that two things. During the entire Chavismo-Madurismo period, a government on the left has been so insensitive and unresponsive to what is perhaps the most important progressive story in Latin America since the mid-2000s, which is the rise of demands from society to advance the rights and views of the LGBTQ community. It's really remarkable. It's very behind the times for Latin America. It's even behind the times relative to Cuba and Ecuador and Bolivia, countries that are very much part of the ALBA groups. So that is remarkable. But it is also remarkable that the opposition, which, as we have heard, includes religious groups and where the Catholic Church and evangelical churches play a role, has been able to make room for this. Not as much as we would like it, but this is what the Tamara Adrian case represents. Tamara Adrian is a wonderful transgender woman with a successful career as a lawyer and in defense of human rights, and fighting an impossible fight in Venezuela, and that she has been able to become an alternate deputy representing one of the opposition parties is really remarkable. There aren't that many examples like hers in Latin America. It's a small space. Clearly, much more needs to happen. Much more needs to happen both in the government and in the opposition. But it is a nice flowering, I would say. And again, the interesting story is that there was no room for this type of spring coming from the government, and there was a little bit of an opening happening from the opposition. Let's hope this flowering extends, because it has got to be one of the most powerful demands coming from these societies, from the young generations, that we need to be able to be very tolerant of sexual diversity and gender identity.